I froze. It was supposed to be just a casual lunch with coworkers, light laughter between hurried bites, just another break in just another day. But in that crowded restaurant, lit by tall windows and muffled voices, time stood still. I saw my wife. She was a few feet away from me, at the next table, laughing, with a sparkle in her eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. But it wasn't for me. The man in front of her was saying something and she leaned forward, touching his arm without thinking, as if the intimacy between them was old, comfortable. I felt a pop in my chest. I felt a kind of pain that doesn't bleed, but shatters inside. My hands sweated, the words stuck in my throat, and the only thing my body was able to do was walk over. When she saw me, the laughter died in her mouth. The shock in her eyes was as evident as the lie she blurted out without thinking. "It's just a business meeting, just like yours," I smiled. On the outside. Because on the inside my world was falling apart. But I didn't make a scene. Not then. Not there. I left her with her business colleague and went back to my table, but I could no longer hear what was being said around me. Everything turned to noise. The food lost its taste. I had been betrayed. And the most desperate thing was not the act itself, but the banal theater with which she tried to cover it up. She wasn't embarrassed. She was just bothered by having been caught. This ate away at me in a new way. A way that didn't allow for immediate anger, but rather a coldness that grew with every beat of my heart. I needed to know. I needed to find out who that man was, what had been between them, since when, why. The why hammered hard. I started investigating. Yes, as if I were a real-life cheap detective. I read deleted messages on her phone that she thought were really deleted. I went through location histories, contacts, schedules. I discovered encounters. I noticed how, while I worked overtime to keep the house comfortable, she would redo her lingerie. How, on the weekends when she said she was visiting her mother, she would indulge herself with someone else. Encounters in ordinary, discreet hotels, always the same places. There was no love there. It was something lower. Desire. Boredom. Me. I was the faithful husband. The man who left notes on the fridge, who bought wine on our anniversary, who gave her massages on the nights she said she was exhausted. But that wasn't enough for her. And, somewhere in my life, without me realizing it, I stopped being a priority. I confronted her. Not the first time. It took me a while. I collected evidence, dates, times. I watched. I was a spectator as my own marriage fell apart. When I faced her for the last time with the truths laid out on the table, she cried. For the first time in a long time, she cried. But not out of guilt. She cried out of fear. Fear of losing what she no longer deserved. And yet, even after everything, she had the courage to ask me to rethink. She said that it was all a mistake, a moment of weakness, that I was the love of her life. That I never stopped being that. But there, in front of her, all I could think was, how do you trust someone who makes you feel so small again? She tried to seduce me. With sweet words, with empty promises. Even with the body that once hypnotized me. She tried to turn the betrayal into a stumble, and not a choice. But it wasn't just a stumble. It was a series of conscious decisions that she made, night after night, while I cooked dinners and took care of the house. When you love someone, you don't cheat. You talk. You face it. But she chose to run away. And now, lost in the ashes of the lie she created, she tried to rebuild something with pieces that no longer belonged to me. She came to me a few days later. Once again. She was different. Undone. Her makeup was smudged, her smile dead. She said the other man didn't want a commitment. That he had disappeared after she broke up with me. That she had been alone. And that she had been stupid, blind, foolish. That I was the best she had ever had. And, in a lower voice, she tried one last card. can we try again, start from scratch? And there, in that sentence, she dug her own abyss. Because there is no more, from scratch, after betrayal. There is only an, after. And my after no longer had room for her. I replied calmly, you want to start over. But I'm done. And I turned my back, without hate, just with the clear conscience of someone who knows they won't have to carry that weight anymore. But what destroyed me the most was realizing that, even after everything, a part of me still wanted to believe. That for a second, in some dark place in my soul, I considered. And that's when I realized how much betrayal steals from us. Not just marriage. It steals our ability to trust. To believe. To feel safe in the eyes of others. And even now, after time has passed, after new paths, new encounters, new beginnings. I still hear the echo of that question she asked me, do you still love me? And perhaps most frightening, was the answer my soul screamed silently. But there was something else. Something I only discovered much later. A revelation as unexpected as it was painful. A final hidden piece in the puzzle of our story. Something she did, or didn't do, that would completely change the way I saw everything that had happened. Something I never imagined, and that would make me understand that not all betrayals end when the door closes. Some continue whispering in the dark for a long time. And it was at that moment, that I realized that this story was not over yet. Not for me. And certainly not for her. Welcome to the channel. Here, we make it clear from the beginning, we do not support any kind of betrayal. All the stories you hear are fictional, created to show, with intensity and realism, how much betrayal is capable of destroy lives, families and hearts. Get ready now to dive into a narrative deep, exciting and shocking. Fasten your seatbelts. The story is about to begin. Her name was Elena. She had that kind of serene beauty that didn't ask permission to take up space, but that, once noticed, remained engraved. Her brown eyes seemed to hold an entire past, even when she smiled. And she smiled often, especially when she was with Daniel. They got married 10 years ago, after 5 years of dating and many more of friendship. Their relationship was built on an almost silent complicity, a harmony that friends said they admired. Elena worked in architecture and brought the same delicacy with which she designed projects to her daily life. She was meticulous, attentive to details, and passionate about the ways to transform a space into a home. Daniel, on the other hand, was more practical, more direct, but equally committed. He was a financial analyst at a technology company, the kind of person who learns to calculate risk even when choosing a restaurant where they will dine. He had a calm manner, few words, and a patience that seemed infinite, especially with her. They lived in a spacious apartment, with windows that let in light in the morning and views that offered peace at night. The home they built was a reflection of both of them, functional yet cozy, with books stacked in strategic corners, scented candles in the rooms, and paintings hand-picked by Elena. On weekends, they enjoyed cooking together. She was in charge of the seasonings, he took care of the music and the wines. The routine was comfortable, safe, and the life they led seemed like a pact of stability. They had mutual friends, a solid social circle, and a family that respected each other's boundaries and choices. They didn't have children yet. They talked about it from time to time, their tone more contemplative than urgent. They both wanted to, but they believed there was time. And for now, time seemed to be on their side. Daniel loved watching Elena when she was focused. Sometimes he would see her in the corner of the room, sitting on the floor, sketching out some idea on her tablet or rearranging the cushions on the couch, and he would find himself thinking how lucky he was. Not because she's pretty, but because she's light. Elena always seemed to know how to control the mood in the house, how to turn a difficult day into a bearable moment. She was one of those women who listened without interrupting and gave advice without judging. The rare kind of presence that doesn't take up space, but also never goes unnoticed. He truly admired her. I never said it outright, but I was proud. And even if, over time, the more intense gestures had given way to predictable habits. Daniel liked knowing that he could count on her, and that she would be there, at the end of each day, with a calm look, as if to say, "I'm with you." Elena was also proud of her husband. He was never the most romantic man in the world, and she knew that from the beginning, but he was reliable. He was the type who preferred to show affection with practical actions. He fixed things that broke in the house, remembered to fill up her car without her having to ask, and made a point of accompanying her to every family dinner, even though he hated long conversations. Daniel was predictable, in a good way. He never made her feel insecure, he never needed to be confronted with dubious attitudes. Elena believed she had chosen the right one. And when her friends commented on the ups and downs of their own relationships, she found herself smiling silently, without bragging, but with the clear knowledge that she had a balanced partner by her side. Over time, their lives settled into a rhythm that was too comfortable. Dinners out became fewer, spontaneous trips gave way to pre-planned itineraries, and long kisses turned into good morning pecks. But none of this seemed to worry them. After all, this was the reality of many couples, they said. There were no big fights, no great distances. Sex, although more spaced out, was still affectionate. And affection, for both of them, was as important, if not more important, than desire. Mondays were predictable, Fridays were full of promises that almost never came true, and Sunday nights were always silent, as if time respected that moment of preparation for the following week. The only thing that seemed to escape this constant cycle was Elena's new project. An ambitious renovation of an old building in the city center. Something she embraced with the same enthusiasm she had when, years before, she had decorated her first apartment alone. It was a contract that demanded a lot from her, endless meetings, last-minute changes of plans, and a new team that demanded almost all of her attention. Daniel understood. Or, at least, he tried. At first, he made a point of supporting her, listening to her nightly reports about challenges with suppliers, budget problems, and tight deadlines. But as the months went by, he began to feel like a bystander. It seemed like he was there just to listen, and no longer to share. Their conversations became more objective. Elena started arriving late, sometimes forgetting to let us know. Daniel, on the other hand, immersed himself more in his work. He started taking on extra projects, hanging out more with his colleagues, and even going back to the gym, something he had neglected. There was no sudden distance between them. It was something subtle. Like a crack that doesn't make a sound but spreads. Neither of them saw it as a crisis. Just as a phase. Adult life, after all, was made up of phases, they said. And as a mature couple, they knew how to deal with it. The special dates continued to be remembered, even if with less enthusiasm. The dating anniversaries, the celebratory dinners, everything happened punctually. But there was no longer any sparkle in the eyes. There was respect, affection, but no longer any surprise. The house was silent, but not hostile. Elena still made him coffee on Saturdays, and Daniel still hugged her before going to bed. But everything seemed a little more automatic. A little more practical. A little less engaging. There was, however, one thing that was starting to bother Elena, the feeling of being watched. Not at work. Not on the streets. But at home. It was as if Daniel had developed a new kind of look. A look that was no longer the same as before. There was no distrust, nor anger. It was a more curious look. As if he was searching for something in her. As if he was trying to understand a language that had not yet been spoken. Sometimes, she found herself uncomfortable with his silence. Daniel, on the other hand, had nights when he would simply stare at the ceiling, mentally replaying conversations, memories, trying to understand at what point they had stopped being two. What held them together, he thought, was history. The shared past. The solid foundation built over so many years. But he was beginning to wonder if that was enough. Not that he thought about breaking up, but sometimes he imagined himself alone. And the image, to his surprise, did not cause him to panic. Just a slight discomfort, like someone facing the unknown for the first time. Elena, on the other hand, seemed increasingly absorbed by commitments. The nights were short, the weekends were full of social engagements, and family lunches were increasingly rare. There was something in her demeanor that was beginning to change. Little things. A new perfume. A greater care with her appearance, even on ordinary days. A slight impatience when he asked about her plans for the week. And, as much as he tried not to think about it, Daniel felt that something was different. But different doesn't mean wrong, he repeated. People change. Couples change. The important thing is to keep the dialogue going. So he decided that they would take a trip. Nothing grand. Just the two of them. A weekend away from spreadsheets and projects, just to reconnect. When he proposed the idea, she smiled but hesitated. He said his schedule was tight and it would be difficult to fit it in. But he promised to try. Daniel noticed the effort in the response. And at that moment, I wanted to believe that everything would go back to normal. That it was just a phase. That the love they built was strong enough to survive the demands of routine. What he didn't know, and what he would soon discover, is that behind that smile there was much more than tiredness or distraction. There were choices being made. Words left unsaid. And a reality that was slowly slipping through his fingers, even when everything seemed under control. That Friday began like so many others, silent, methodical, shrouded in the predictability of someone who knows every step of the day before even getting out of bed. Daniel woke up a few minutes before the alarm clock and stayed there, watching the timid light coming through the cracks in the curtain. Beside him, Elena was still sleeping with her face partially covered by her hair, breathing lightly and her body curled up. She seemed peaceful, far from everything that was consuming him. He couldn't say exactly what was bothering him, but that feeling of being outside his own home, even inside his own house, was growing. He got up slowly, made coffee and left without making a sound. On the kitchen table, he left a note, "Good luck at the meeting, I love you." He wanted to remind her, and himself, that they were still together, that what they had built still made sense. On the way to work, Daniel thought about the weekend. He had already booked the hotel, a cozy cabin in the mountains. He was sure Elena would like it, even though lately she seemed hesitant about everything that involved the two of them. At the office, the day passed slowly. His mind insisted on wandering, always returning to home, to the silences between conversations, to the averted glances during dinner. Something was different and he knew it. But maybe everything could be fixed. All she had to do was say yes, all she had to do was agree to the trip, all she had to do was show her desire to be with him, just the two of them, like before. This thought kept him going until the end of the afternoon. When he finally sent the last spreadsheet and turned off the computer, his heart raced. He picked up his cell phone and sent a quick message, "Do you want to go out for dinner tonight? I have a surprise for you." Elena responded only hours later, claiming that the meeting had lasted longer than expected and that she was exhausted. She said she would rather stay home and rest. Daniel, although disappointed, tried to understand. He stopped at the market, bought wine, prepared a simple dish, lit candles and waited for her. She arrived shortly before 9, her eyes marked by fatigue, but with light makeup that he found strange. She was too pretty for a meeting. Her dress was new, her perfume different. She thanked him for the dinner, smiled briefly, but ate little. They talked about trivialities, as if they were both avoiding what really needed to be said. When Daniel mentioned the trip, she hesitated once more. She said that her schedule was tight, that it might not be the best time, that she could cancel the following week's commitments, but she wasn't sure. He insisted, asked her to trust him, that he needed this time for the two of them. And she, after a few seconds of silence, agreed. But her tone was more of concession than desire. In the following days, something changed in Elena's behavior. She seemed more attentive, more affectionate, almost like before. She started sending him messages during the day, asking if he needed anything, making breakfast before he woke up. Daniel wanted to believe that this was a sign that everything was getting back to normal. But there was something wrong with her, small gaps of absence in her eyes. As if she were present, but not completely. Some nights, she took a long time to come home from work, and even when she was home, she seemed to occupy another mental space. Daniel noticed this for the first time in a concrete way when he tried to hug her in bed, she hesitated, as if the gesture had lost its naturalness. He stepped back, respecting her time, but something in his chest began to burn. It was a Wednesday afternoon when everything started to go wrong. A coworker invited him to a casual lunch, and when he arrived at the restaurant, Daniel didn't expect to find anyone he knew. But when he walked in, the first thing he saw was Elena. She was sitting by the window, smiling in a way he hadn't seen in a long time. Across from her was an elegant, unfamiliar man. Her smile was different. Loose. Full of something he no longer recognized. Daniel stopped. Time split in two. This wasn't a business meeting. Elena's body was leaning forward, her fingers playing with the napkin, her eyes lost in his. Daniel felt his stomach churn. A lump tightened his throat. His colleagues called him to the table, but he didn't answer. He walked toward her with a step he didn't know where it came from. When Elena saw him, her face paled. The man in front of him also fell silent. The silence was interrupted by a short sentence, spoken by her with effort. "Honey, this is a professional contact, we're talking about a project." Daniel pretended to believe him. He didn't want a scandal, not here. He simply greeted the stranger with a cold handshake and headed to his table. But something inside him had broken with a silent crash. He spent the rest of lunch staring at his plate, listening to fragments of conversations he didn't understand. He left before the others went home. He waited. He didn't say anything that night. He didn't ask questions. He just watched. And Elena, for her part, kept up the facade. She acted as if nothing had happened. She sat next to him on the couch, commented on the news, smiled at the movie. But Daniel was no longer the same. He began to scrutinize the details of her routine. Schedules, subtle changes, new clothes. He began to notice that her long lunches coincided with the days when she went out more dressed up. A dormant instinct of distrust began to stir within him. They went on the trip that weekend. The cabin was exactly as he had imagined. The mountains, the silence, the wine. And for a few hours, everything seemed genuine. Elena laughed at his jokes, they danced to an old song on the porch, made love like they hadn't done in months. Daniel felt something close to hope. But the next day, when he saw her unlocked cell phone on the table, an impulse overcame his reason. He read messages he couldn't imagine. Intimate words, promises, scheduled meetings. His name came up frequently. The same man from the restaurant. A name that repeated itself like a sentence. When he returned from the trip, Daniel was different. Calmer on the outside, more destroyed on the inside. He didn't talk about what he saw. Not yet. He needed to understand. He needed to confirm. And that's what he did. Over the next few weeks, he followed Elena discreetly, recorded the times, confirmed the places. He discovered the pattern. The same hotel, the same afternoons, the same lie disguised as tiredness. There was no longer any doubt. The betrayal was real. And it wasn't new. It was built. Federal repeated. Elena had made choices. And those choices had a name, a face, an address. The night he decided to confront her, Daniel didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just handed her her cell phone with the screen lit up, showing the last message. She was silent for a few seconds, then sat down in front of him. She tried to explain. She said she felt invisible, that everything had become monotonous, that she wasn't looking for love, just something that would make her feel alive. But nothing she said was enough. Daniel was no longer the same man from that routine of dinners and silences. He looked her in the eyes and said he needed time. He didn't promise anything. He just got up and left. He left her there, surrounded by the emptiness she herself created. But there was something Elena didn't know yet. A detail Daniel had discovered in the midst of his pain, something buried beneath the layers of lies. A secret that made everything even more unforgivable. And that detail would change the course of everything. Daniel spent the next few days in absolute silence, not for lack of words, but for the absence of any feeling he could name. The apartment remained the same, with its custom-made furniture, the paintings chosen by Elena, the shared books. But now everything seemed like a set for an empty theater. The sounds of routine became annoying noises, and her presence, even discreet, was deafening. She walked around the house with the lightness of someone who didn't know what was coming, or perhaps with the weight of someone who already sensed that what was coming would never be returned. Daniel had emotionally distanced himself from everything that concerned her, as if the bond that united them had dissolved in silence. He observed her attempts to maintain a semblance of normality, the messages left on the mirror, the coffees prepared before he woke up, the gentle tone in their daily conversations, and he could no longer feel anything but indifference. There was no more anger, nor sadness, only a deep tiredness and a painful clarity about everything that had been lost. That Monday morning, he decided to leave for work early, not because he had anything important to resolve, but because he needed to breathe different air, hear different sounds, escape the space where all his memories now seemed contaminated. Halfway there, he stopped in front of his lover's building. He already knew where he lived, he had easily researched it. He stayed in the car for several minutes, watching the movement, trying to understand what kind of man he was. The gate opened, and for a moment Daniel saw his face clearly. There was nothing extraordinary about his appearance, no striking features, no imposing presence. He was just an ordinary man. But that was exactly what hurt him the most, realizing that he had been replaced by someone who didn't even seem worthy of being a rival. At that moment, the pain turned into a decision. Not a confrontation, but a break. He didn't want revenge. He wanted freedom. The next day, he went out to lunch with colleagues from the company once again. The atmosphere was light, the jokes flowed naturally, and for a moment, Daniel allowed himself to laugh. He really laughed. He laughed with relief. When the waiter brought the menu, a movement in the background caught his attention. Turning his head slightly, his eyes froze. At a nearby table, Elena was there again. The same man in front of her. The same gesture of touching his arm. But something was different, she was smiling too much, with her hand on her chin, enchanted. It was as if the world around her didn't exist. Daniel didn't hesitate. He got up, walked over to their table and stopped. They both looked at him at the same time. She turned pale again. But this time, she didn't say anything. Not a word. Her lover looked away, disconcerted. Daniel didn't speak to either of them. He just turned and left, with a serenity that bordered on cruelty. That night, Elena waited for him awake, sitting on the couch, her eyes fixed on the door. When he came in, she stood up and started talking before he could even put the keys on the table. She said there was no way to justify it, that she didn't expect him to forgive her, but that she needed to explain. She needed to tell him what she felt, what had brought her there. Daniel listened to her in silence, his eyes fixed on her as if he were trying to find an old version hidden in that tired face. She talked about loneliness, about neediness, about the feeling of having lost herself along the way. She said he was the love of her life, that she had made a mistake, that she deeply regretted it. But Daniel remained motionless. When she finished, he answered in a low, firm voice, as if he was no longer looking for answers. You destroyed the only part of my life that still made sense to me. And now you want to rebuild something with the pieces? That's impossible. In the following days, coexistence became unbearable. Elena tried to stay present, tried to win back, tried to find her way back. Daniel, on the other hand, was already preparing his departure. He spoke to a lawyer, organized his documents, looked for a new place to live. There was no more room for doubt. The marriage was over, even though the papers were still on the table. At the end of that week, he called her to talk. They sat at the kitchen table, as they had done so many times, to discuss bills, trips, and household decisions. But this time, he was determined. He said he was leaving. That he had already signed the papers. That she would keep the apartment, that he wanted nothing more than the peace he had lost. Elena cried. He begged. He said he could change, that he could try, that they could start over. And then, in a final gesture of desperation, she approached, placed her hand on his chest and whispered, "What if we started from scratch?" Daniel stepped away, took a step back, looked into her eyes with a coldness he had never felt before. "You want to start over, but I'm done." And then he turned around, grabbed his keys, and left. As he walked to the elevator, he heard the muffled sound of her crying coming from the kitchen. But he didn't hesitate. He no longer belonged there. He no longer carried the guilt. Standing on the sidewalk, he took a deep breath and continued on. That night, he stayed in a small hotel on the other side of the city. Simple, comfortable. In the room, for the first time in weeks, he slept soundly. There was no more weight on his chest. Just a new, almost comfortable silence. In the morning, he woke up early, had coffee on the hotel balcony and watched the city awaken. The sky was clear, the air fresh. He picked up his cell phone, read some ignored messages, and among them one, in particular, caught his attention. It was from an unknown number, sent the day before. "We need to talk. It's about her. Something you might not know yet." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He hesitated for a few seconds, but he answered. In less than half an hour, he received an address and a name. It was someone who knew Elena. Someone who claimed to have important information. Something that would change everything. And in that moment, Daniel knew that the story was not over yet. There was still something hidden, something that had escaped even his watchful eyes. And that he needed to know. Daniel didn't respond to that message immediately. He read the text more than once, reread the details, confirmed the number, and still preferred to observe in silence for a few hours. His mind was already exhausted from surprises, it carried more questions than he could organize, and he still felt the weight of the confrontation from the night before on his shoulders. The image of Elena, standing in the middle of the kitchen, begging for a new chance, repeated itself in his head like a restless memory that refused to disappear. He couldn't decide whether to feel pity, contempt, or just distance. What existed between them now was a chasm so wide that even the most sincere words would seem too fragile to cross it. And yet, that message, that text sent by someone unknown, promising a new revelation, made his heart beat differently. He knew that if he followed it, it would open another door. Maybe it would be the last. But there was something in his essence that didn't allow him to leave loose ends, and so, that very afternoon, he decided to answer the call. The chosen place was a discreet coffee shop, far from where they usually went. It was a common place, with light-colored walls, small tables and instrumental music that was barely understandable. Daniel arrived first, chose a secluded corner and watched each person enter through the door. When the woman appeared, he recognized her without ever having seen her before. The firm posture, the attentive eyes and the restrained expression of someone carrying important secrets. She sat down across from him, greeted him by name, and thanked him for coming. Her name was Laura. She said she had known Elena for a few years, that they had worked together on projects, but that they were never exactly friends. They pretended to be friendly, as so many adults are forced to do. She didn't seem interested in beating around the bush, so she got straight to the point. She told him that the man Elena had gotten involved with, the one Daniel had run into more than once, was actually an old acquaintance. Someone who had been in Elena's life long before their marriage, someone who, according to Laura, had always exerted a strange influence over her. A poorly resolved cycle, full of comings and goings, lies and manipulations. The thing was, though, Elena had never ended it in a suit. On the contrary, behind the scenes of her relationship with Daniel, she had maintained contact with this man for years, albeit intermittently, in veiled messages, occasional meetings, and a long sequence of omissions that Daniel never imagined existed. But there was more. The reason Laura decided to look for him was not just to inform him about this history, but to tell him something that would completely change his understanding of everything. During the months that Elena was involved with that man again, she used the intimacy and trust of marriage to obtain favors, open doors, and infiltrate interests in Daniel's personal and professional circles. Nothing illegal, nothing that could be punished by law, but morally unforgivable. A type of emotional exploitation disguised as a partnership. Laura explained that, throughout her life with Elena, she had witnessed conversations, listened to phone calls, and even witnessed an occasion when she confessed to feeling divided, but she continued to nurture the relationship, using Daniel as a safe base so as not to lose her balance. When asked why she didn't break with the past once and for all, Elena reportedly said that she didn't know how to live with stability alone, that she needed risk, warmth, and a sense of challenge. It was as if Daniel were the harbor and the other, the storm. Daniel listened to everything without interrupting. His face expressed neither revolt nor shock. It was as if, deep down, he already knew. As if I had felt each of these things in disconnected fragments and now, hearing it out loud, it all fell into place in a cruel and definitive way. When Laura finished speaking, he thanked her. He said he didn't need anything else. That now everything made sense. He paid for the coffee, got up and left without looking back. He walked down the street with slow steps, while the late afternoon bathed the buildings in orange tones. He felt empty, but at the same time, relieved. It was as if he could finally breathe air without lies. As if, for the first time in a long time, I was alone, and that was good. In the days that followed, Daniel plunged into a state of intense reflection. He avoided seeing Elena, even though they lived under the same roof for a few more days until everything was legally resolved. She seemed to sense the end in every gesture, but she continued to insist on small approaches. She tried to cook his favorite meals, left the bed meticulously made, sent long messages during work hours talking about how much she missed him and regretted him. But he didn't respond. Not because he wanted to punish her, but because any attempt at dialogue sounded artificial. The connection had been broken to an irreversible depth. The most painful thing was not the betrayal itself, but the fact that it had been so precisely planned. Knowing that, for so long, he had been a passive spectator of a theater set up inside his own home, made everything an almost surreal experience. But life, silently, began to fill the spaces that the void had left. One afternoon, at an external meeting, Daniel met someone. She was a consultant who had recently joined the team of an important client. Her name was Clara. She had a calm voice, a firm gaze, and a way of speaking that mixed sweetness with objectivity. There was nothing about her that reminded him of Elena, and perhaps that was why Daniel allowed himself to listen more attentively, to smile more lightly. They began to exchange work ideas, then messages on various subjects, then occasional coffees. There was no rush. There were no expectations. There was just a mutual recognition that something could blossom there, calmly, without empty promises, without urgency. Meanwhile, Elena was slowly saying goodbye to the life she had lost. The apartment felt strangely empty when Daniel finally left. She walked through the rooms trying to find signs of what had been, rereading old messages, rummaging through photos, letters, and small objects. What had once been routine had become a ruin. She tried to reconnect with her lover, but found doors closed. He had moved on, leaving behind a trail of what he had never promised to build. It was at this point that Elena began to understand the true meaning of the word consequence. There was no more home. There was no more shelter. All that remained was the chosen solitude. Daniel, in turn, was rebuilding himself in silence. He got involved in new projects, rediscovered forgotten pleasures, met old friends, felt his body less heavy and his thoughts clearer. With each passing day, I realized how much I had missed out on living by being stuck in a relationship that no longer existed, but that I insisted on maintaining out of loyalty to a past that would never return. And, by Clara's side, even though everything was initial and undefined, there was comfort. Not of belonging, but of possibility. The idea that love, even after everything, could make sense again. But there was something Daniel hadn't resolved yet. One last gesture. One last conversation. Something that needed to be said, not by her, but by him. Something that would end the cycle once and for all, not with anger, but with maturity. And that was why, on a Sunday afternoon, he returned to the apartment one last time. He knocked on the door like any other visitor. Elena opened it, surprised. She was thinner, her eyes tired. The silence between them was heavy. He came in and sat on the same sofa where they had so often watched movies, had dinner, shared silence. And then he spoke. He said everything he needed to say. About what he had discovered, about what he felt, about how hard it had been to accept that their love was over. But now, finally, he understood. It was no longer hate, nor pain, it was just, the end. Elena cried, but she didn't ask for anything else. She just listened. She knew that this was the final goodbye. When he got up and walked to the door, she asked him quietly if he had been able to be happy since then. And he answered sincerely, without vanity, "I'm learning." Then he left. And he didn't look back. On the street, the wind was light, and the sky seemed clearer than on any other day. The walk to the car was slow, almost symbolic. As if each step was confirmation that, despite everything, it was possible to move on. And at that moment, Daniel knew clearly, some stories do not end with forgiveness, nor with a return. Some stories end with learning. And with the silent chance to start over. The morning after his last meeting with Elena, Daniel woke up with a kind of serenity that was still foreign to him, as if his body was finally understanding that it no longer needed to resist. The new apartment, still with its unpacked boxes and bare walls, felt more honest than any impeccably decorated apartment he'd ever had. Every silence there was his. Each step echoed freedom, even if that freedom still hurt in some corners of memory. He made his coffee slowly, watching the street through the window, noticing how the details of ordinary life had become important again, the sound of distant traffic, the smell of toast coming from downstairs, the muffled sound of children laughing on their way to school. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he didn't have to run. It could just be. The phone rang around noon. It was Clara. The conversation began with an unpretentious invitation to a design and innovation event she would be attending. Daniel hesitated for a few seconds, not because he was afraid of her, but because he didn't know if it was time to share his new life with someone other than himself. He accepted. Clara was different. She didn't ask too many questions or pressure. She simply offered her presence. And that night, as they walked through the event hall, among modern panels and people exchanging ideas as if they were saving the world with each sentence, Daniel observed her gestures, her attentive eyes, the way she listened to each explanation with genuine interest. He felt small compared to her intelligence, but not diminished. On the contrary, he felt challenged to grow. When they left the place and went for a walk under the cold lights of the city, she said little, but when she did, she went straight to the point. She said there was something about them that she didn't want to rush, but that she also didn't want to ignore. He agreed. And then, without plans, she held his hand lightly. Not as someone who arrests, but as someone who accompanies. In the days that followed, their relationship developed naturally. They exchanged music, shared secrets, talked about movies, and had questions about work. And, slowly, Daniel stopped comparing himself. He stopped projecting Elena's gestures onto Clara, the emptiness of the past. He began to accept that the woman in front of him was another story, another time, another kind of love, if he could still call it love. But he didn't need to define it. He just had to live. And that was enough. However, as is often the case in life, peace is never permanent. On a rainy Tuesday, as he was leaving work, Daniel saw Elena on the other side of the street. She was standing under an awning, soaked to the knees, with her arms crossed as if she were waiting for something she already knew would not come. He thought about crossing the street, pretending not to see her, but something pushed him to the other side. When he approached, she smiled with a weariness that time cannot hide. She said she did not expect to see him, but Daniel knew that she was waiting for him. They remained silent for a moment, until she asked if they could talk, away from the noise, the rain, the rush. He pointed to a nearby cafe, small and empty at that hour. They sat facing each other once again, as they had so many times before, but now like two strangers trying to remember the language they had in common. She started by saying that she didn't want to get back together, that she didn't expect a reconciliation, but that she needed to talk. He said that in the last few weeks he had understood everything he had ignored for years. Now, with distance, he realized that it wasn't just the betrayal that hurt him, but the slow abandonment, the small gestures she didn't make, the words she didn't say, the looks she looked away. She confessed that she had gotten used to the stability that Daniel offered, that she thought it was guaranteed, and so she looked for something outside, something that would make her feel alive, without realizing that, by doing so, she was killing the very thing that kept her going. Tears flowed discreetly, but Daniel did not move. He just listened, because that, yes, was necessary. Not to get back together, but to end it with truth. When she asked him if he had found someone, he hesitated, then said that he had met someone who made him feel at peace. Elena smiled, with a mixture of sadness and relief. She said that she wanted him to be happy, truly. That she hoped he could experience everything that she had prevented him from feeling by her side. And then, in a low voice, she confessed something that surprised him more than anything she had said until then. She said that, despite everything, she still loved him. But that she no longer wanted to be loved back, because now she understood that to truly love also means knowing how to leave. Knowing how to let go. Daniel didn't answer. He just looked at her respectfully. When they stood up, she hugged him gently, as if she were returning something she didn't know how to keep. Then she left without looking back. And at that moment, Daniel knew that this was the last time. There would be no more returns, no messages, no unexpected encounters. It was the end. Clean. Painful. But necessary. In the following weeks, Daniel and Clara grew even closer. There was no rush, but there was commitment. One day, she asked him what he was looking for in a relationship. He was silent for a while, then replied, peace. And truth. She smiled, as if she understood exactly what that meant. And from that moment on, they built a different kind of intimacy. One that didn't require promises, just presence. Daniel relearned to enjoy Sundays, simple movies, dinners at home. He started playing the guitar again, reading before bed, and cooking slowly. He relearned to be himself, but now in a different version. More mature. More aware. More whole. One afternoon, while visiting an old friend, Daniel heard a phrase that echoed in his mind, some people break us, but they also shape us. And that was when he understood. Elena had not only been a disappointment. She was a milestone. A before and an after. And even with all the pain, she had led him, albeit through crooked paths, to a truer place. Perhaps that was the great dilemma, how can you hate someone who, at the same time that she destroyed you, also freed you? That night, as he walked with Clara through an open-air market, with lights strung between trees, sounds of distant guitars, and the aromas of simple food in the air, Daniel realized he was no longer looking for answers. I just walked. No fear. No guilt. With a new story being written, one that required no explanations, just presence. And so, slowly, he went from being the betrayed man to becoming the free man. But even when everything seems calm, life still has its final movements. Daniel would receive, days later, an unexpected letter, with no clear sender. Handwritten, with letters that he would recognize even with his eyes closed. It was from Elena. And inside that letter, there was something he would never expect, something that still needed to be said. And that final detail. That last whisper from the past, would change everything he thought he had already understood. It took Daniel a few minutes to open the envelope. His hands held the paper with a strange mixture of repulsion and curiosity, as if the time that separated him from Elena still existed on that paper, pulsing between its lines. He recognized the handwriting immediately, slanted, meticulous, full of curves that seemed too delicate to contain any kind of bitter truth. He sat on the porch, the sky already dark, and took a deep breath before starting to read. The letter was long. It didn't ask for forgiveness, it didn't beg for someone to return it, it didn't seek compassion. Instead, it was a confession. A deep dive into the darkest areas of everything they had lived, not just at the end, but from the beginning. Elena wrote with an evident weight, as if she knew that this was the last vestige of her own dignity. She admitted that her involvement with the other man had not been just impulsive or needy. It had been planned. Initiated by her. Nurtured with the intention of feeling more alive, more desired, more in control. But mostly, it had been an unconscious response to the silent envy she had harbored of Daniel for years, for his serenity, his constancy, his ability to remain steadfast even when everything was falling apart. Throughout the pages, Elena revealed that her lover had indeed been a constant presence in her life since before the marriage, but the most destructive thing of all was the fact that she had deliberately allowed him to orbit the relationship she had built with Daniel, like a slow, almost invisible poison. The goal, even if unconscious, was to sabotage something she felt she did not deserve. She also confessed that, in the more stable phases of the marriage, she felt suffocated by a happiness she did not understand, and that was why she tried to destroy it. At the end of the letter, the revelation that Daniel had not expected, Elena had discovered that the other man had been in a parallel relationship all along. She had not been his lover, she had been one of several. What she had considered special, unique, was just another game. And more than that, he had used confidential information that she shared, not only about Daniel, but about other people as well. Her lover had disappeared when this came to light, leaving her with a broken conscience and a shattered pride. She wrote that, since then, she had lived in isolation, afraid to face what was left of herself, and that letter was the last act of someone who finally recognized the monster she had become. Daniel read every last word, folding the paper carefully. He no longer felt anger. There was no satisfaction either. Just a kind of mourning. Not for the marriage, but for the woman Elena could have been and chose not to be. It didn't erase what she had done, it didn't restore anything, but it gave him the certainty that, however cruel the path had been, he had been right to leave. Throwing the letter away would be too easy. Keeping it would be masochistic. So, calmly, he placed it in the fireplace. He watched the flames consume letter by letter, leaving in the air only the smell of burning paper and a silence that asked for no further explanation. The following week, Daniel traveled with Clara. They went to a quiet village, surrounded by nature, with no cell phone signal, no plans, no itinerary. Just the two of them, trying to rediscover how simple love can be when you don't have to prove yourself all the time. They walked along trails between tall trees, laughed at banal jokes, talked about books and futures and fears. She didn't demand anything from him. She didn't demand confessions or promises. She was just there. And that was enough. One particularly cold night, sitting in front of an improvised campfire, Clara asked if he still thought about her, about Elena. Daniel took a while to answer. Then he said that he did. Not with longing, but like someone looking at an old scar and remembering exactly how much it hurt when it opened. But he also said that he could now see the past as a part of him that was left behind, and that, as painful as it was, it allowed him to find himself. Clara looked at him for a few seconds, smiled and hugged him tightly. And there, in the middle of nowhere, he felt that he had finally arrived somewhere. Meanwhile, Elena remained silent. She had cut ties with her old friends, didn't answer calls from her family, and refused invitations to meet up. She lived in a small apartment, supported by a simple remote job. Her social media accounts were gone, her old photos were deleted, and her days were filled with books she never finished and movies she paused halfway through. She no longer sought answers. She was simply trying to figure out how to rebuild an identity without the foundation she had destroyed with her own hands. One rainy night, while tidying up a drawer, she found an old photo. She and Daniel, smiling in front of a church tower during a trip. For a moment, she held the photo tightly, as if the image could speak. And then, for the first time since everything had fallen apart, she truly cried. Not out of superficial regret, but out of deep understanding. What she had lost was not just a marriage. It was the chance to have been a better person with a man who truly loved her. A few months later, Daniel, now reorganized in his new life, was invited to give a talk about leadership and emotional integrity at a professional event. He accepted, not out of vanity, but because he felt that, somehow, he could transform his pain into a voice. He went up on stage with confidence, spoke about choices, about coherence, about the weight of silent decisions. And at the end, he mentioned, without naming names, that he had once trusted someone too much and was betrayed in a devastating way, but that this forced him to look within and realize that integrity is not only about resisting mistakes, but about continuing to be true even after being broken. The audience gave a standing ovation. And he left the stage with a peaceful heart. He knew that his story had touched people. And that, in some way, this was the definitive conclusion to everything. Today, Daniel and Clara live together. Not in a fairy tale, but in an honest partnership. They argue, make mistakes, learn, laugh. And above all, they trust. They know that life isn't perfect, but they also know that truth is the only soil on which you can build something that lasts. Elena, for her part, remains alone. She has been trying to rebuild herself, attending therapy, writing texts that she never publishes, taking walks in the morning. Maybe one day you will forgive yourself, maybe not. But, in any case, he carries on his back the price of the choices he made. And he understands, with the clarity that only absolute loss brings, that some things, once broken, never go back to being the same. Now that you've come this far, comment below what you thought of this story. What would you do in Daniel's place? Would you have forgiven Elena? Or would you have made an even more radical decision? Your opinion is very important to us. Also, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. This was more than just a story of betrayal. It was a portrait of how one wrong choice can destroy everything that took years to build. Betrayal doesn't just hurt the other person, it also destroys the person who commits it, because it breaks the most sacred bond between two people, trust. Let this story serve as a warning. True love cannot survive lies. It requires presence, effort and, above all, respect. And never forget, this channel never supports any type of betrayal. Here, we tell stories to show how the truth, even when it hurts, is still the best way. See you next time.